Let's talk about corporate social responsibility. What responsibilities do corporations have? I'm going to be considering Schwartz and Carroll's model, a three-domain model of corporate social responsibility. It's something that's become influential and I think is very useful in certain respects, although it's also easy to be misled by it. And I think Schwartz and Carroll themselves are somewhat misled by their own picture of the three-domain model. Let's start with an earlier version of this. It's Carroll's 1991 pyramid model. The idea here is that there are 4 levels of corporate moral responsibility. The bottom level is purely economic. It's the basic level of corporate responsibility. After all, a corporation has a responsibility to its owners, to its shareholders, and perhaps to others who actually have a stake in some way in the business. But let's start with the purely economic responsibilities. Be profitable is the maxim that the corporation should follow at this level. It has a responsibility to the owners, to the shareholders, to the employees, and to others, perhaps customers, suppliers, and so on, to try to be profitable, to try to actually thrive as a business. After all, it isn't just the owners that want the business to thrive. The employees typically do too. The customers who like doing business with them want them to thrive. It's been painful to many of us to see some of our favorite businesses go out of business during the pandemic. A shutdown is hard and it kept them from earning profits for a long time. Employees also suffered during that time, being laid off from jobs. And so employees, customers, and others have a stake in the business too. In any case, there are economic responsibilities, however narrowly or broadly we define them at that basic level. One step up from that are legal responsibilities. The corporation has a responsibility to obey the law, to follow the laws that govern its activities. Here we're talking not just about laws that are specific to business activity, but laws more generally. The company has a responsibility to follow the law. A level above that are ethical responsibilities. These are responsibilities that are expected of the business. The others, the legal ones, the economic ones, are actually required. This is required in a different way too. It is expected that the business will behave ethically, that it will keep its promises, respect its contracts, and do other things that are its ethical responsibilities. At the very top level are philanthropic concerns. And these are the ones that are not required, not expected, but according to this model are desirable. These are activities where the business goes beyond what is required of it and what is expected of it in an economic, legal, and moral sense to do other charitable activities. So this falls into the class of what philosophers have traditionally called the imperfect obligations. These are still perhaps ethical obligations, or sometimes they're not perhaps ethical obligations at all. They're simply things that would be nice. So the top level of things, be philanthropic, in other words, help others, be generous, help the community. This is something that occupies the top level. Not expected, not required, but nevertheless desirable activities on the part of business. The maxim governing that top level is be a good corporate citizen. Be a good citizen within the community. And that's something that is not required, is not expected maybe even, but is desirable. Well, that's the pyramid model in a nutshell. Schwartz and Carroll, writing about this some years later, think there are some aspects of the model that are misleading. One of them is simply the idea of the ordering, the idea that at the base level are the economic, one step up from that the legal, one step up from that the ethical, and at the top the philanthropic. What exactly is the ordering? What puts economic concerns at the base level? What does it mean that ethical concerns are higher than that legal concerns are somewhere in between? Well, there is no very clear meaning to that sense of ordering. It's tempting to read it as an ordering of importance. But is earning a profit really more important to the business than obeying the law? Well, maybe sometimes, but in general you might think they're really on a par, or if anything, the legal concerns seem more fundamental. And what about ethics? Why is it simply listed here as expected as opposed to required? After all, respect for people's rights seem to be something that's required. Even if it's not required legally, it seems to be required ethically. In fact, that brings out another sort of problem with this, which is The distinction among the levels. First of all, there's a lot of overlap. It may be that at certain points there are legal as well as moral responsibilities to shareholders that are economic in nature. And so the same responsibility could be economic and ethical and legal at the same time. In addition to that sort of overlap, there can be the possibility of clash. It may be that a contractual provision made in good faith at the time later turns out to commit the company to something that is either economically disastrous or is actually illegal. And so the potential for conflicts between these levels, and we'll come back to talk about that later, but it's very significant. After all, there can be ones just between the law and ethics. Some ethical requirements are written into the law, some aren't. Some laws may themselves be unjust, the way they're enforced may be sporadic and unjust, and so on. And so there can be a lot of conflicts as well as overlap among the various levels. So they're not very clearly distinct at all. Now, I think there are other problems with the way that Schwartz and Carroll describe the model. For one thing, they characterize the top level, the level of philanthropic concerns, as supererogatory, something that goes above and beyond the call, above and beyond any sense of obligation. But being charitable and being a good corporate citizen, or for that matter, being generous, being charitable as an individual person, is what philosophers have traditionally called imperfect duties, imperfect obligations. And so they're not really viewed as things that are merely above and beyond the call of duty. You should be generous. You should help people in need. You should contribute to your community and your surroundings, your family, and so on. However, any given act is something that does allow you some choice. So it may be that you should be helpful, you should contribute to your community, but it doesn't mean that you should take every single opportunity to contribute to your community. Indeed, that might be impossible. And so there is a line to be drawn here between the heroic, the going above and beyond the call of duty, and then simply the exercise of generosity, charity, and so forth, where you do have some choice about how to get involved, but nevertheless, it isn't just heroic that you do this, it is something that you are in general expected to do. Another problem with their description is the identification of the ethical with what is expected by society. Obviously, there's a problem there. It may be that your society expects you to be ethical, but on the other hand, societal expectations and the requirements of ethics do not have to agree. They don't have to be the same thing. Your society might expect things that are actually unethical, for example. And there might be ethical demands on you that your society is just blind to. It has no equivalent expectation. And so we shouldn't identify ethical requirements, ethical demands, duties, obligations, simply with what society expects. Society may expect all sorts of things. And of course, it's not just that society may in effect be getting the ethical wrong. Social expectations are much broader than ethics. Society expects you to behave in a certain way at a formal dinner, but it's not unethical to use the wrong fork when you go to eat your salad. And it's not just etiquette that's a matter of this. There are certain codes of behavior. Certain things are expected about the way people will dress, about the way they'll interact, the way they'll behave in all sorts of social settings. But somebody who dresses in a toga to go to a business meeting in contemporary Austin, or somebody who dressed in a contemporary business suit to go to a business meeting in ancient Athens, would be violating social expectations, even though there's absolutely nothing unethical about what they're doing. Well, the last problem is related to the distinction between imperfect obligations and the supererogatory, the going above and beyond the call of duty. And that is that it seems odd to characterize the philanthropic as merely desired by society. There are lots of things that are desired by society that may have nothing to do with being a good corporate citizen. And there may be things that are required, really required to be a good corporate citizen, that are not just desirable, but are something stronger. In fact, maybe they're not desired at all by that society, and yet they would be extremely helpful and ought to be done. And so we should be careful about the things on the right side of that pyramid. I think those are at best very rough characterizations to give you some general idea of the difference of the levels. But really, they are not very good characterizations of what the economic, the legal, the ethical, and the philanthropic are all about. Schwartz and Carroll propose a different kind of model, a three-domain model, which they symbolize in terms of Venn diagrams. The Venn diagrams, shown here, show economic, legal, and ethical concerns as the three basic kinds of considerations. But of course, they can overlap. You can have concerns that are both economic and ethical, both economic and legal, both legal and ethical, and then of course all three. Notice that this attempts to solve several problems with the pyramid model. First of all, we can allow that these overlap. We aren't committed anymore to sharp lines between the various levels. Secondly, there is no ordering. These things are independent circles in the Venn diagram. There's no obvious sense in which one has precedence over the other or is viewed as more fundamental than the other. The way that Schwartz and Carroll characterize this model is in terms of actions that have certain motivations. They say, for example, that the ethical are actions intended to meet conventional, consequentialist, or deontological standards. The legal circle contains actions that are intended to obey the law, to foreclose litigation, for example. The economic concerns are those intended to confer economic benefits on the company, so to make a profit, to increase returns in general, to increase the value of the firm. Presumably then the things that are in the ethical and economic overlap are the things that are motivated both by economic and by ethical considerations. In the center, you find things where the intention here is to make profits, to obey the law, and to be ethical. Well, what about that purely economic one? The way it's described, it sounds like those are actions that are motivated purely by economic considerations without any particular concern for legal or ethical issues. You might expect that within an ordinary business, that's most decisions, really. Luckily, most of the time, ethical concerns are not at stake, legal concerns are not at stake. If I'm thinking about the possibility of introducing some new menu items at my restaurant, for example, I'm not usually worried about the ethics of doing so or about the law requiring me or prohibiting me from doing certain things. I have to be a strange restaurant to think about actually violating the law here. If I'm thinking, what are some new combinations that we could put for toppings on our pizzas? Well, I'm not really concerned very much about the law, about ethics. I'm thinking primarily, what will sell well? What will make us money? What will be appealing to customers and perhaps attract new people to the restaurant? In any case, that seems to be most actions. But Schwartz and Carroll describe that class very differently. They say these are things intended to make money, but that are unethical and illegal. Well, now, wait a minute. You might say my choice of a certain menu item, like deciding as a local pizza shop did to create a twig and branch pizza that has arugula on it and a sour cherry sauce and various other things. It's actually delicious. But you might say, wait, that it's not illegal, it's not unethical, but I wasn't worried about ethics or the law here. I was just thinking, hey, what would be an interesting pizza that people might want to try and that might attract some new people in? There are two possible interpretations here, and we've got to be careful to distinguish them. We might have in mind, by the ethics circle, for example, things intended to fulfill ethical obligations. Or we might have in mind things that do actually satisfy the requirements of ethics. Same thing in the economic sphere. We might have in mind things that are intended to make profits, or things that actually do succeed in making profits. Same thing with the law. There can be things intended to comply with the law, and that's a different thing from actually complying with the law. It should be obvious that I can try to make money and fail, that I can try to obey the law and get it wrong and, in fact, violate the law. That I can try to be ethical, but fail at that too. And conversely, it may be, in fact, most of the time it is, I think, in business, that I am complying with the law and I am complying with any ethical requirements, even though I'm not thinking about ethics or the law at all. I'm just thinking about what would be a good business decision in economic terms. So we've got to decide here, what are we really talking about? Are we talking about motives? Are we talking about responsibilities? Are we talking about results and whether I do actually make a profit or comply with the law or comply with ethical requirements? What are these circles really representing? Now, the vast majority of the article is actually dedicated to things that companies were motivated to do for economic reasons, but that were actually illegal and or unethical. But it seems to me that's not what the circles really were described as representing. And so something fishy goes on here. In any case, what does any of this have to do with corporate social responsibility? Is it just a matter of not doing unethical things and not breaking the law? That's the way it sounds in this article. Your responsibility is just obey the law and be ethical. Well, that sounds like Milton Friedman, actually, who says your obligations are to make a profit, to obey the law, and to be ethical. And what he means by that specifically is respect people's rights. Don't violate people's rights. And indeed, most of Schwartz and Carroll's examples of unethical behavior are violations of rights, either harming people directly or at least creating significant risk of harm for people. So it looks as if, wait, there's nothing here that Milton Friedman would be unhappy about. The people who oppose corporate social responsibility are not saying it's okay to break the law, it's okay to be unethical and violate people's rights. So it seems to me that describing things in this way just mislocates the issue. Nobody's really going to contest the idea that you should not violate people's rights and that you should, in general, obey the law. Of course, it might turn out to be an unjust law. That's a special problem. It might be that claims of rights in this particular culture you think are unjustified. No, people really don't have a right to that. Well, that, again, is a separate issue. But in terms of, making a profit, justifying illegal action, or justifying real violations of rights, nobody's for that. Nobody opposes corporate social responsibility if that's what it means. If we try to think about the contrast between the managerial and stakeholder theories, we can maybe get a better grip on what's going on. Milton Friedman is the major proponent of the managerial theory, often called the stockholder theory or the shareholder theory. The idea there is that a business has its primary responsibility to its shareholders. And so its responsibilities are to make money, to obey the law, and to be ethical. We've contrasted that with stakeholder theory. Edward Freeman says that a business has responsibilities to all of its stakeholders, all those with a stake in the company. That includes employees, customers, suppliers, and perhaps the larger community. So let's try to do a better job of characterizing this. To do it, we have to draw a distinction among those ethical responsibilities. We have to distinguish the perfect from the imperfect obligations, the things that are required for respecting people's rights, as opposed to the things that would be beyond that would not be necessarily above and beyond the call of duty or heroic or something like that, but that do involve acts of charity, a matter of being a good corporate citizen beyond just not harming people or risking harm to people or in other ways violating their rights. If we think of things in those terms, we can maybe understand this better. Think about the economic concerns, the legal concerns, and the ethical concerns where some subset of those actually involves people's rights and the obligation to respect their rights, but is broader than that. Now we can say, look, among the stakeholders are the shareholders, are the employees, are the owners of the company, and the customers, and so on. So there are going to be economic responsibilities to all of those groups. So the economic responsibilities, we can worry about how broad they are and how narrow they are, but both sides are going to agree that there are significant economic responsibilities. The same thing is true with legal responsibilities. Both the managerial and the stakeholder theories are going to say that you have an obligation to obey the law. What about the ethical side? Well, there's no disagreement among the perfect obligations, the ones that are involved in respecting people's rights. The dispute comes in the part of the circle here that I've left uncolored. the imperfect obligations of an ethical character. And notice I'm talking here about responsibilities. Responsibilities that are ethical responsibilities that go beyond respecting people's rights, but also are not involved with economic considerations or legal considerations. There's no legal responsibility to do these things. There's no economic responsibility to do these things. It's not a question of respecting people's rights, but nevertheless you might think we should contribute to the good of the community. And it's that kind of thing, that kind of charitable action, that's really at stake here. Now, even Friedman says, look, I've got no problem with that if it doesn't cost the company anything in the end. Maybe it's even good business practice to get people good publicity, to improve your brand image, to make this a better community so that your employees are happier, so that it's easier to attract talent to your company, and so on. And so really, in the end, it's only some subset of that uncolored region, only a small subset of the things that would be charitable obligations going beyond any economic or legal or rights-driven obligations. It's a matter of things that would actually impose a net cost on the company, that would actually be economically inadvisable. Not things that would be wise expenditures, but nevertheless you think are required of you to promote the good of the community. Now again, imperfect. Maybe that specific way of doing it is not required. But that you in general do things at a real cost to yourself that will improve the community. You think, yes, I should do that. That is an ethical responsibility of mine. So it's really that class that the managerial and the stakeholder theory disagree about. Now I've been talking so far about responsibilities to do things, but we could also interpret all of those circles in terms of a negative interpretation, responsibilities not to do something. And so we could think of the economic responsibilities there as responsibilities not to be profligate, not to be foolish with shareholders' money. We could see the legal responsibilities as responsibilities not to do certain things. There might be certain things where they overlap, which are both illegal and inadvisable from an economic point of view. Then that band of uncolored region would be the things that, well, we have an imperfect obligation not to do. Philosophers don't talk much about that. In ethics, the main examples of imperfect obligations are charitable obligations to help others, to contribute to your community, to your country, to your family, and so on, but also obligations to yourself, obligations to develop your talents, for example, to become more virtuous. There are different virtues you could develop, different talents you could develop. You get to choose, but nevertheless, you should improve yourself, and you should develop talents, you should develop virtues. But notice there aren't paradigm examples of negative ones. However, it's not hard to think of negative, imperfect obligations. In fact, if you think of Aristotle's picture of virtues as means between extremes, you immediately get this picture. And if you've ever been on a diet, you immediately get the picture. Yeah, you can have a few treats, but not too much, right? Yes, you can actually be concerned for yourself, but not too much. You can do all sorts of things, but only up to a point, not too much. You've got to refrain a certain amount of the time. Now, when you give in to the temptation or give in to the desire, and when you resist, that's up to you. You've got some choices, hence it's an imperfect obligation. However, it is a real obligation, and it's one that allows you choice. So there are plenty of negative opportunities to think about this in ethical terms as well as purely prudential terms. Well, there may be things like that. A company can indulge itself in certain ways, but not too much. It can pursue its own interests, but it has to be careful, not too much. It can cut some economic corners. It can require people to work overtime, for example, but not too much. It might be a matter of not hiring too many temporary workers, for example, or not polluting the air and water too much, or creating too much noise. Those are negative, imperfect obligations too. And so part of being a good corporate citizen isn't just, making charitable contributions to the community. It's partly also with respect to your employees, your suppliers, your creditors, and the community at large, knowing when you can do a little, but not too much. That's something that is involved with the idea of virtue being a mean between extremes, and that's part of corporate social responsibility too.